The year 1882 bled into autumn with a raw gust of wind, the kind that tasted of dust and distant frost. It was the first true wind of the season in Dry Willow, a town that seemed held together by little more than grit and sun-baked timber. The wind tore down the single wide street, whipping red dust into little cyclones that danced and died. It slammed a loose shutter against a wall with a crack like a pistol shot. Above the blacksmith's forge, a wooden sign bearing the fading image of a hammer and anvil groaned on its iron hooks, swinging violently as if trying to tear itself free. The fine ochre dust settled on everything, coating the glass of the mercantile window and finding its way through the tightest sealed door jambs. A constant, gritty reminder of the land's unforgiving nature. A man walked into this wind, leading a weary-looking roan gelding whose coat was matted with sweat and dirt. The man was Wyatt Hale. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that spoke of long miles in the saddle. His duster, the color of a faded sky, was frayed at the cuffs and hem, a testament to countless campfires and sudden storms. It flapped and billowed around him, but he seemed as unmovable as a desert rock. Tightly cinched to his hips was a gunbelt, the leather dark and oiled, the Colt revolver holstered within it riding with a familiar weight. It was more than just a tool. It hung there like a physical manifestation of his past, heavy with decisions made and consequences borne. He kept one hand on the horse's reins, the other hanging loose, fingers slightly curled, a breath away from the worn wooden grip of his sidearm. His eyes, narrowed against the stinging dust, swept over the town, taking in the bat-wing doors of the saloon, the stark white paint of the new church, and the low-slung roof of the post office. He saw not buildings, but angles, cover, and potential threats. His face was a mask of hard-won neutrality, a canvas of sun-browned skin and faint lines that told no stories but hinted at many. Inside the cramped confines of the Dry Willow Post telegraph office, Lydia Hart worked against the rhythm of the wind. The clatter of her telegraph key was a sharp, metallic counterpoint to the low moan that seeped through the window frames. Her fingers, nimble and sure, tapped out messages and transcribed incoming ones, the tiny clicks and silences forming a language that connected their small, isolated world to the bustling cities of the north and east. A stray smudge of violet ink, the color of a dusk sky, stained the side of her hand, a small imperfection in her otherwise precise world. The northern line had just brought news, the kind that settled like a stone in the stomach of a cattle town, a glut in the market. Calf prices were plummeting. She had transcribed the message with a heavy heart, knowing that each dot and dash spelled hardship for the small ranchers who scraped a living from the unforgiving soil surrounding Dry Willow. For men who had bet their entire year on that season's calves, prices falling was a phrase as devastating as well gone dry. She pushed a stray strand of auburn hair from her forehead, her gaze drifting to the window, where the dust-choked street offered little comfort. Wyatt Hale's arrival had not gone unnoticed. In a town like Dry Willow, a stranger was an event, a disruption to the slow, predictable cadence of daily life. Whispers followed him like his own shadow, passed from the mercantile to the livery, from the church sewing circle to the smoky interior of the saloon. The rumors were varied and contradictory, each one painting a different, dangerous picture of the man. Heard he rode with the Black Creek gang till he had a falling out, a man said over a warm beer. Shot his way out and left 3 of 'em in the dirt. Another, leaning against the general store's porch, claimed otherwise. Nah, he's a railroad man, one of them troubleshooters they send in to clear out squatters before they lay track. Colder than a tombstone, they say. But the most common sentiment, the one that clung to him like the dust on his coat, was simpler and more ominous, whatever he is. Trouble ain't far behind him. The town watched him, their curiosity warring with a deep-seated instinct for self-preservation, from the relative cool of the saloon. Sheriff Mason Lyle observed Wyatt through the gap in the swinging doors. Lyle was a man past his prime but not past his usefulness, with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen enough trouble to recognize its scent. He wasn't a man for grand gestures or heroic stands. He was a peacekeeper, and his job was to maintain the delicate, often fragile, equilibrium of the town. He watched Wyatt tie his horse to the hitching post, noting the way the man's hands were never far from his gun, the constant, weary vigilance in his posture. Lyle pushed himself off his chair, walked to the doorway, and leaned against the frame, letting the wind tug at his vest. As Wyatt turned, their eyes met across the dusty expanse. "Hale." The sheriff's voice was low, not a challenge but a statement of fact. "Keep that iron in its leather while you're in my town." Wyatt offered no verbal reply, just a slow, almost imperceptible nod. The acknowledgement was enough. The first rule had been laid down. The town's isolation was more than just a matter of miles. A week ago, a flash flood, born from a freak storm in the high country, had roared down the shallow creek bed. The churning, muddy water had torn at the wooden bridge that was the town's main artery to the south. The central span had been ripped away, leaving a jagged, impassable gap. The crossing was now a treacherous affair, and the main trail to the sprawling Silverwash cattle ranch was all but cut off. Supplies were already running low at the mercantile, and the mail was delayed. The broken bridge served as a constant, visible reminder of their vulnerability, a symbol of how quickly nature or fate could sever their ties to the outside world. In the quiet, orderly space of the Dry Willow Bank, a one-room establishment that smelled of old paper and sealing wax, Thaddeus Pike dipped his pen in a pot of black ink and closed his ledger. The sound of the heavy cover shutting was final, a soft thud that echoed the closing of a coffin lid. Pike was a man of meticulous habits and quiet ambition. He wore a starched collar even in the oppressive heat, and his hands were soft and pale, untouched by the manual labor that defined the lives of his clients. He ran a finger down the column of names in the ledger he had just closed. It was the land mortgage ledger, and in recent months, the list had grown alarmingly long. The names of small ranchers, families who had worked their land for a generation, appeared again and again. With the calf prices falling and the bridge out, their margins for survival, already razor-thin, were about to vanish entirely. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Pike's lips. He saw not hardship, but opportunity. The telegraph key began to chatter again, pulling Lydia from her thoughts. This message was different. It wasn't market news or a personal telegram. It was official, clipped, and urgent. She transcribed it with a growing sense of unease. A survey team was en route. They were to arrive within the fortnight. The purpose to map the valley for a proposed dam project. The words settled in the air of the small office, charged with dread. A dam. For months, it had been a distant rumor, a whisper of progress that few took seriously. But this message made it real. People in Dry Willow knew what a dam meant. It meant progress for some, but for those whose homesteads and grazing lands were in the low-lying areas, it meant ruin. It meant their land, their homes, everything they had, would be swallowed by rising water. The fear, which had been a low hum in the background of their lives, was now a clear and present threat. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Wyatt Hale stood by the livery, currying his horse. He worked with a slow, methodical rhythm, his movements gentle and sure. The hard work seemed to ease some of the tension from his shoulders, but his eyes were not on the horse. They were fixed on the low hills to the east, the same hills the survey team would one day cross. He stood there for a long time, a solitary figure against the fading light. The wind had softened, but it now carried a new scent on its breath, the damp, earthy smell of impending rain. It was a smell that often stirred up the past, and as his hand came to rest on the butt of his Colt, it was not out of habit, but out of a deep, unsettling feeling. The wind smelled of rain, but to Wyatt Hale, it felt like it carried the scent of old business, of troubles he had long tried to outrun, now converging on this dusty, forgotten town. Tonight, the past and the future were blowing in on the same wind, and he was standing directly in its path. The daily rhythm of Dry Willow pulsed through Lydia Hart's hands. By day, she was the town's formal connection to the world beyond the dusty plains. She logged the incoming telegrams into a heavy, leather-bound ledger, her penmanship a series of neat, controlled loops. She sorted the mail that arrived on the twice-weekly stagecoach, placing letters into the grid of small wooden boxes that lined the wall, each one a small portal to a private life. Her official duties were a world of regulations, postage stamps, and the precise impartial clicking of the telegraph key. But when the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the main street, Lydia's other work began. This work was not logged in any book. It was paid for in loaves of fresh bread, a jar of preserved peaches, or simply a grateful, weary smile. She kept a small, clean box behind her counter filled with rolls of linen bandages, bottles of carbolic acid, and packets of dried herbs. She was the one the ranchers' wives called for when a fever wouldn't break, or when a child's fall resulted in a cut that bled too freely. More than once, under the soft, flickering light of a single kerosene lamp in a remote homesteader's cabin, she had helped bring a new life into the world, her calm voice a steady anchor in a storm of pain and fear. She moved through this second life with a quiet competence, her small, capable hands as skilled at setting a poultice as they were at deciphering the staccato language of the wire. It was a duty she had taken upon herself, a way of weaving herself into the very fabric of the community, tending to its wounds, both seen and unseen. Wyatt Hale, meanwhile, sought to remain apart from that fabric. He paid the blacksmith a few coins for the use of a vacant stall behind the forge, a space that smelled of hot metal, coal smoke, and horse. It offered shelter but little comfort. His first task was always the same. He would unsaddle his roan, his movements economical and practiced, and lay the heavy leather saddle over a wooden rail. Then, he would take a bucket and draw water from the blacksmith's well, the chill of it shocking against his skin even through the afternoon heat. He worked stripped to the waist, and it was then that his body told the stories his face concealed. His back and shoulders were a roadmap of past violence, old scars, long since healed into silvery lines, crisscrossed his skin. One, however, was different. It was a puckered, angry-looking mark high on his left shoulder, the kind left by a bullet that had torn through muscle and sinew. As he sluiced the cold water over his arms and chest, washing away the grime of the trail, the muscles around the old wound would sometimes seize and jump involuntarily, a phantom twitch from a pain long past but never forgotten. He ignored it, his expression unchanging, his focus solely on the task at hand. He was a man accustomed to living with his ghosts, carrying them as surely as he carried the revolver at his hip. He moved through the world as if expecting a blow, his body a fortress built to withstand it. In the days that followed, the whispers about him began to coalesce, the vague anxieties hardening into a specific, compelling narrative. The story took root in the saloon and spread from there, passed from man to man over games of faro and glasses of whiskey. Heard it from a fellow who rode through from the territories. One ranch hand confided to another. Said Hale wasn't with a gang, he was against one. The Cantrell boys. They'd taken over a small way station, had the whole family pinned down. Hale rode in alone, got a woman and her boy out through the back. Then he went back in. The teller paused for dramatic effect, leaning in closer. He faced down Jed Cantrell himself, shot him dead center. But Jed's brother, Silas, he got away, swore he'd hunt down the man who killed his kin, no matter how long it took. The story transformed Wyatt in the town's imagination. He was no longer just a drifter, a potential threat. He was a hunted man, a figure of tragic, violent heroism. The danger he represented was not his own, but one that followed him, a debt of blood that could be called due at any moment. Lydia heard the story, as she heard everything in Dry Willow, but she filed it away with the rest of the rumors. She preferred the evidence of her own eyes. One afternoon, she saw it. She was stepping out of the post office just as young Sam Gable, the baker's son, was running an errand. The boy, all of 8 years old, was clutching a small stack of letters his mother had asked him to post. He tripped on an uneven board, and the letters scattered, several fluttering directly into the muddy runoff ditch that ran alongside the street. The boy's face crumpled, tears welling in his eyes at the sight of the soiled envelopes. Before Lydia could even call out to him, Wyatt Hale was there. He had been leaning against the livery, seemingly lost in thought, but he moved with a surprising quickness. He didn't say a word. He simply knelt down, his tall frame folding to the boy's level. He carefully plucked each letter from the murky water, wiping the worst of the mud off on his own duster sleeve. He checked to make sure the ink addresses were still legible, then handed the damp bundle back to the boy. "They'll be fine," he said, his voice low and unexpectedly gentle. He gave the boy's shoulder a brief, reassuring squeeze and then straightened up, retreating to his spot against the wall as if the moment had never happened. Lydia watched, a strange feeling stirring in her chest. The man who spoke in actions, not words, had just revealed more of himself than any rumor ever could. That evening, in the hazy, lamplit interior of the saloon, Thaddeus Pike conducted business of a different sort. He sat at a corner table with a newcomer, a man with the soft hands of a city dweller and the arrogant eyes of someone accustomed to power. This was Grant Wexler, the lead surveyor for the dam project. Pike poured him a generous measure of whiskey from his private bottle. "To progress, Mr. Wexler," Pike said, raising his glass. Wexler smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "To progress, Mr. Pike, and to the opportunities it brings." Unrolled between them on the table was a large, detailed map of the entire valley. Their heads bent close together, their quiet laughter barely audible above the saloon's din. Wexler's finger traced the proposed waterline, a blue curve that sliced across dozens of small, independently owned parcels of land. Pike's finger tapped on the section labeled Silverwash. "And this will be the crown jewel," Pike murmured, a greedy glint in his eye. "Once the smaller holdings are acquired." They shared another look, a silent, complete understanding passing between them. Later that night, long after the last drunk had been pushed out of the saloon and the town had fallen into a deep, windswept silence, Lydia sat alone in her office. The lamp cast a warm, circular glow on her desk. She couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. She pulled out the telegram from Fort Cannon, the one that had announced the survey team. She read the words again, her eyes catching on a line she had almost overlooked in her initial haste. Water levels projected to reach the Dry Willow town line at maximum capacity. The edge of town. It wasn't just the outlying homesteads that were threatened. The dam's reach extended to their very doorstep. The message, which had once seemed like a distant problem for others, now felt like a cold hand closing around her own throat. From his rented stall, Wyatt could hear the faint, melancholic sound of music drifting from the church. The pastor's wife was practicing on the small pump organ, and the tune that carried on the night air was Shenandoah. It was a song of rivers, of leaving, of a love that crossed wide, impassable distances. The mournful melody found a crack in Wyatt's carefully constructed armor. For a moment, the hardness in his eyes softened. The constant, vigilant tension in his shoulders eased. The music spoke of a longing for a home he could not name, a peace he could not find. It was a fleeting moment of vulnerability. Then, as the final notes faded into the sound of the wind, the mask slammed back into place. The softness vanished, replaced by the familiar, shadowed watchfulness. The next day, Sheriff Lyle found Lydia sweeping the boardwalk in front of the post office. He tipped his hat, his expression serious. "Morning, Miss Hart." He got straight to the point. "I've seen you watchin' Hale, and I saw him help the Gable boy. I know you see the good in folks, but a man like that, he's like a lightning rod in a thunderstorm. He draws trouble, for your own sake. I'm asking you to keep your distance." Lydia stopped sweeping, leaning on the broom. She met the sheriff's concerned gaze without flinching. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Sheriff, with all due respect, I spend my days sending messages across hundreds of miles of empty land. I know what real distance is." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And it isn't measured by rumors." Night fell again, harder this time. The wind picked up, no longer just a moan but a shriek. It rattled the window panes and whistled through the keyholes of every door in Dry Willow. It was a restless, probing wind, seeking out every weakness, every crack. And in the quiet, guarded spaces within Wyatt Hale and Lydia Hart, something shifted. It was like the soft, metallic sound of a key turning in a lock that hadn't been touched in years, a door that had been bolted shut against the world, against the past, against the possibility of pain, had just begun to tremble on its hinges. The storm was coming, both outside and in the thin light of a lantern hanging from a rusty nail. Wyatt Hale unrolled a small bundle of oil-tanned leather. The stall was his sanctuary, the scent of hay and horse a familiar comfort in a world that offered little of it. Inside the leather was not a weapon or a map, but a single, fragile photograph, its edges softened and frayed with time and touch. It showed a woman with his eyes, a gentle smile playing on her lips, holding a swaddled infant in her arms. His sister, Ilara. Rain had streaked the image long ago, blurring her face into a memory, a ghost of a smile. The scent of wet earth and gunpowder filled his senses, a phantom smell from a past that was never truly past. The image in his hand dissolved, replaced by the flickering, chaotic light of torches against a sheeting rain. It was the night the Cantrell gang descended on Ilara's homestead. They were not soldiers or lawmen, just predators drawn by the scent of vulnerability, a ranch run by a woman whose husband was away on a cattle drive. Wyatt had been there, mending a fence, a temporary stop on his endless wandering. He remembered the splintering crash of the door, the terrified cry from his sister, the glint of a knife in a rough hand. He remembered moving without thought, his Colt seeming to leap into his hand of its own accord. In the swirling chaos, he saw the leader, Jed Cantrell, a big man with a cruel laugh, grabbing for the cradle. Wyatt's shot was clean, precise. The big man fell, and the chaos turned to panicked retreat. He had saved them. He had done what a brother was supposed to do. But the memory always soured, the victory turning to ash in his mind. He looked at the photograph again. The raid had sent Ilara into early labor. The baby, his nephew Daniel, had come into the world amidst violence and fear. But the true danger hadn't been a bandit's bullet. It was a fever that came in the night, days later, insidious and relentless. A fever that the country doctor couldn't break. Wyatt had held her hand, watching the light fade from the same eyes that now looked out at him from the photograph. After she was gone, the family fractured. In the grief and confusion, with his brother-in-law a broken man, the infant Daniel was passed to distant relatives heading east, swallowed by the vastness of the country, lost. The knowledge was a constant, dull ache beneath his ribs. He had fired his gun to protect his family, and in the end, it hadn't mattered. The silence he wore now was not a choice, it was a scar, a fortress he had built around the wound, brick by painstaking brick. He carefully rolled the photograph back into its leather sheath and tucked it away. The lantern flame guttered, casting his shadow, long and solitary, against the rough-hewn wall. In her small living quarters behind the post office, Lydia Hart slid a wooden box from beneath her bed. It held the few personal belongings that had made the journey with her to Dry Willow. Her fingers brushed past a collection of pressed flowers and a small book of poetry before finding a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter, dated a year prior, from a hospital in St. Louis. It was a formal acceptance into their volunteer nurse training program, a path she had desperately wanted, a future she had meticulously planned. She held the paper to the lamplight, the crisp, official words a stark contrast to the life she now led. Her mind recoiled, pulling her back to the reason the letter remained tucked away in this box. It wasn't a choice, but a flight. She remembered a blistering summer afternoon back in the small Kansas settlement where she had grown up. A frantic mother pounding on her door, screaming about her son. Lydia had run with her, her small medical kit bumping against her hip. The boy, no older than 10, lay by a creek bed, his legs swelling at an alarming rate, 2 small, dark puncture marks just above his ankle. A rattlesnake. She had done everything she knew how, everything the books had taught her. She'd cut the wound, tried to draw out the venom, applied a tourniquet until her fingers ached. She'd sat with him for hours, bathing his forehead with cool water, watching the poison creep through him, relentless and unforgiving. She remembered the awful helplessness, the feeling of her knowledge turning to dust in the face of such a swift and brutal force of nature. He died just after sunset. She never forgot the sound of the mother's silence, a grief so profound it had no need for tears. That failure had broken something inside her. She had packed her bags a week later, unable to face the sympathetic, pitying eyes of her neighbors. Her work in Dry Willow, the bandaging and the midwifery, was not a career. It was an act of penance, a quiet attempt to reclaim the piece of herself she had left by that Kansas Creek bed. She folded the letter and put it back in its box, sliding it firmly out of sight. She turned her attention to the present. On the wall of the post office, beside the official notices and wanted posters, she had started a new section. It was a collection of small, handwritten notes she had received from the local ranchers. They were pleas for help, written in the shaky, uncertain script of men and women more comfortable with a branding iron than a pen. Mr. Pike added, "A service fee to our loan. Says it's for protection. Protection from what read one. Another. The interest on our seed loan doubled. He says the contract allows it. We can't read the fine print." Each note was a testament to the slow, quiet desperation creeping into the valley. Pinning them to the wall was a small act of defiance, a way of making the private suffering public. This was a different kind of poison, and she was determined not to feel helpless against it again. The following afternoon, Wyatt found himself at the edge of town, where the dirt road dissolved into the prairie. A large, weathered wooden cross stood there, marking the entrance to the small, windswept cemetery. It was a stark, lonely sentinel against the vast, empty sky. He stood before it, his hat in his hand, though he had no one buried there. The relentless wind had found a loose strand of wire on the nearby fence, and it played across it, creating a high, thin, keening sound. It was an eerie, mournful noise that sounded disturbingly like the cry of a distressed child. He closed his eyes, the sound scraping at the raw edges of his memory. Daniel. Would he even recognize the boy if he saw him? Would the boy have Alara's eyes? The thought was a knife twist, and he pushed it away, turning his back on the cross and the crying wind. As he walked back toward the center of town, he saw a small commotion gathering in front of the bank. Thaddeus Pike stood on the boardwalk, flanked by two large, thuggish-looking men Wyatt didn't recognize. Before them stood Jedediah Croft, a cattleman well into his 70s, his back bent from a lifetime of hard labor. The old man's face was a mask of weary resignation. "Jedediah." Pike's voice was smooth, but with an undercurrent of cold satisfaction. The terms were clear. The note is past due. The bank is exercising its right to foreclose. He held out a piece of paper. "This is a notice of seizure." Just as Jedediah reached for it with a trembling hand, a sudden, powerful gust of wind, the same wind that haunted the cemetery fence, snatched the paper from Pike's grasp. It cartwheeled through the air, a white speck against the red dust, before tumbling to a stop directly against the toe of Wyatt Hale's boot. The street fell silent. Every eye turned to him. Pike's smooth composure tightened, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. The two hired men shifted their weight, their hands hovering near their sides. Wyatt didn't look at them. He looked at the defeated slump of the old man's shoulders. He bent down slowly, his movements deliberate, and picked up the foreclosure notice. He held it in his hand, the flimsy paper a declaration of war. Then, the door of the post office opened. Lydia Hart stepped out onto the boardwalk. She didn't hesitate. She walked past Pike as if he were a piece of furniture, straight to Jedediah's side. She placed a gentle hand on the old man's arm, a simple, grounding gesture of support. She didn't speak a word of protest to the banker. She simply stood with the old man, a silent shield against his humiliation. Her gaze then lifted, traveling across the dusty street until it met Wyatt's. He was still holding the paper. She looked at him, and in that long, silent moment, an entire conversation passed between them. She saw in his eyes not the cold killer of the rumors, but a reflection of her own quiet anger, her own fierce desire to stand for those who could not stand for themselves. He saw in her not just the prim telegraph operator, but a woman with a spine of steel, whose compassion was an active, formidable force. In that shared look, they ceased to be strangers. A line was drawn in the dust, and they were standing on the same side of it. Wyatt walked across the street, his spurs ringing softly in the charged silence. He stopped in front of Lydia and held out the notice. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she said softly. Pike scoffed, a dismissive, ugly sound. "This changes nothing. The property is forfeit." He turned on his heel and strode back into his bank, his hired muscle following in his wake. Lydia helped the old man to a bench and spoke to him in a low, comforting voice for a few minutes before he shuffled away, his dignity somewhat restored. She turned and went back into the post office. Wyatt watched her go, then followed, stopping at the threshold. Inside. She moved to the telegraph key with a sense of grim purpose. "I'm going to wire the county seat," she said, more to herself than to him. There has to be some kind of appeal process. She began to tap the key. The familiar, sharp clicks echoed in the small room. Then, abruptly, they stopped. She frowned, tapping again. Nothing. The wire was silent, a dead, empty void where a vital connection had been just hours before. The southern line. Their only link now that the bridge was out. She tried again, her movements more frantic. The silence was absolute. "Damn it," she whispered, a rare curse escaping her lips. She looked up at Wyatt, who was watching her. His expression grim, a small, wry, exhausted smile touched her lips. It's been cut. The world had just become smaller, more isolated, more dangerous. They were on their own. She looked at this quiet, haunted man standing in her doorway, a man who drew trouble like a lightning rod, a man who carried his past like a shroud. A part of her, the cautious, sensible part that had fled from failure in Kansas, screamed at her to lock the door, to keep her distance. But the part of her that had stood with Jedediah Croft refused. "If I let you in," she thought, the words a silent plea. "Don't make me regret it." But all she said aloud was, "You look like you could use a drink of water." She turned to the bucket and dipper she kept in the corner, her back to him, a small, tentative offering of trust in a town that was quickly running out of it. He stepped inside, out of the wind, and quietly closed the door behind him. The first drops of rain were fat and heavy, striking the dusty street with audible splats that left dark, coin-sized circles in their wake. It was a false preamble. Within minutes, the sky tore open. The rain did not fall. It drove. A solid, wind-whipped sheet of water that blurred the edges of the world and turned the main street into a churning river of mud. A storm had been lurking behind the hills all day, a brooding, purple mass of clouds, and now it had descended upon Dry Willow with a sudden, biblical fury. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, and the rhythmic drumming on the post office roof became a deafening, chaotic roar. Inside, Lydia had lit a second lantern against the premature darkness. The world outside her windows was a maelstrom of shadow and water. She felt a profound sense of isolation, as if her small, sturdy building were a ship tossed on a black and violent sea. A frantic call from a rancher miles out of town had taken Sheriff Lyle on the road an hour before the storm hit. He would be trapped out there until it passed. She was alone. The thought sent a small, cold shiver down her spine, a feeling that had nothing to do with the damp air seeping through the walls. It was the sound of drunken laughter that cut through the storm's symphony first. It was ugly and sharp, a sound that didn't belong in the clean, violent noise of the rain. She moved to the window, peering through the water-streaked glass. A group of 4 men were stumbling their way up the boardwalk, their shoulders hunched against the downpour. Even in the gloom, she recognized their canvas jackets and sturdy boots. They were from Wexler's survey crew. They were drunk, sloppy and belligerent, their movements exaggerated and unsteady. They stopped directly in front of the post office, their faces, slick with rain, turned up toward her window. One of them, a big man with a thick neck and a mean-spirited grin, pounded a heavy fist on her door. The sound boomed through the small room. "Hello in there," he bellowed, his voice thick with whiskey. "We know you're in there. Little telegraph lady. "We got a message needs sendin'." Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't move. She held her breath, hoping they would give up, that the storm would drive them back to the saloon. Another man, skinnier but with a weasel's cruel eyes, laughed. "A message from Mr. Wexler. He says he needs a clear path for progress, and you're in the way." The first man pounded the door again, harder this time, the wood groaning in protest. "Open up. We just want to talk." A flicker of movement across the street caught Lydia's eye. A figure stood on the covered porch of the bank, partially obscured by the shadows and the driving rain. It was Thaddeus Pike. He was not seeking shelter. He was watching, a still and silent observer to the unfolding scene. He made no move to intervene, his presence a tacit endorsement of the thuggish display. He was there by design, not by chance. The realization turned Lydia's fear to ice. This was not a random act of drunken foolishness. It was a planned intimidation. Her hand went to the heavy wooden bolt on the door. Her fingers were trembling, but she forced them to be steady. With a decisive shove, she slid the thick bolt into its housing. The solid, metallic thud was a small sound against the storm, but it was a declaration. This far, and no further. At the livery stall, Wyatt Hale had been listening to the storm, a familiar companion. But the drunken shouts and the rhythmic pounding on the post office door were a different kind of tempest. He'd seen the survey crew in the saloon, seen the way Wexler kept their glasses full and their ears open to his poisonous whispers. He'd also seen the sheriff ride out, and he saw Pike, a motionless spider in the center of his web. He knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, what was happening. He stepped out from behind the forge, pulling on his duster. The rain hit him like a physical blow, plastering his hair to his scalp in seconds. He didn't seem to notice. He walked into the center of the street, the mud sucking at his boots. He moved with that same deliberate, unhurried pace, as if he were taking a casual stroll. He walked toward the four men, his eyes narrowed, his presence a sudden, quiet challenge in the midst of their noisy aggression. They turned as he approached, their drunken bravado faltering for a moment at the sight of the tall, rain-soaked stranger. "What do you want?" Old Man the Big One snarled, trying to reclaim his dominance. Wyatt didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on them, cold and flat. His right hand came to rest, not on the grip of his Colt, but on the heavy brass buckle of his gunbelt. Lydia, watching with wide, terrified eyes from the window, saw the movement. She saw the implicit threat, the promise of violence that hung in the air, thick and heavy as the storm itself. She braced herself for the explosion, for the deafening roar of a gunshot that would tear through the night. But the explosion never came. In a move that defied every expectation, every law of the frontier, Wyatt's fingers did not go for his gun. They worked at the buckle, with a slow, almost ceremonial deliberation. He unfastened his gunbelt. For a heartbeat, he held it in his hand, the holstered revolver, the neat rows of cartridges, the entire apparatus of his violent past. Then, he let it drop. It landed on the top step of the post office boardwalk with a heavy, definitive clatter. The sound of wood and metal and leather was sharp and shockingly loud, cutting through the howl of the wind. It was a sound of surrender, but it felt like a declaration of war. It was an act of such profound and unexpected trust, of such raw vulnerability, that it stunned the drunken men into silence. Even Pike, across the street, leaned forward slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Wyatt raised his hands slowly, palms open and facing forward, showing they were empty. His eyes never left the four men, but his words were for the woman behind the door. "I'm coming in empty-handed," he said, his voice clear and steady above the storm. Inside. Lydia's mind reeled. She had seen him as a force of nature, a man defined by the weapon he carried. To see him discard it, to willingly make himself defenseless in the face of a threat, was to see the very foundation of his identity, as she understood it, crumble. It was the single most courageous act she had ever witnessed. It was a choice, and it was a question directed at her. "Do you trust me?" Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but something else rose to meet it, a fierce, answering surge of trust. Her hand, which had been clenched around the bolt, now pulled it back. The lock slid open with a groan. She opened the door just enough for him to slip through. He was inside in an instant, and she slammed the door shut, ramming the bolt home again. They stood for a moment in the flickering lantern light, both dripping with rain, their breath coming in ragged bursts. The pounding on the door began again, more furious now, fueled by confusion and whiskey-soaked rage. "The window is next," Wyatt said, his voice low. He didn't waste time. He pointed to the heavy wooden cabinet where she sorted the mail. "Help me." Together, they shoved the cumbersome piece of furniture against the door, adding its considerable weight to the lock. The door shuddered under a heavy blow, but the cabinet held it firm. Wyatt grabbed a loose coil of telegraph wire from her workbench, with deft, practiced movements. He looped it around the cabinet's handle and then secured the other end to a heavy iron stove hook on the far wall, pulling it taut. It wouldn't stop a determined assault, but it would buy them precious seconds. It was a makeshift trap, a piece of civilization turned into a tool of defense. As he finished, a rock, thrown with considerable force, shattered the front window. Glass exploded inward, spraying across the floor in a glittering, dangerous shower. Wyatt grabbed Lydia's arm and pulled her down behind the solid oak counter. "Stay low," he whispered, his face close to hers. "Crawl, don't stand. The glass is everywhere." The smell of the rain on his duster was earthy and clean. A hand reached through the broken window, fumbling for the latch. Another man hurled a lit lantern through the opening. It crashed onto the floorboards, the glass shattering and the burning oil spreading in a whoosh of flame. The fire caught on a stack of newspapers, and greasy, black smoke began to pour into the room. Lydia reacted instantly. While Wyatt was watching the window, she scrambled forward on her hands and knees and, with a powerful, desperate kick, sent the burning lantern skidding away from the newspapers and into a corner where the floor was bare and damp. At the same moment, Wyatt ripped off his heavy duster and threw it over the burning papers, smothering the flames with heavy, repeated blows. He beat at the fire until only a smoldering, smoking pile remained. The room was filled with the acrid stench of burnt oil and paper. Their hair, their clothes, were saturated with the smell of smoke. The men outside, seeing the fire extinguished and their easy access thwarted, let out a string of curses. For a moment, they seemed to regroup, their drunken assault losing its momentum. Across the street, Thaddeus Pike pulled back into the shadows. This had become more complicated than he had anticipated. The cowboy's interference had been an unwelcome variable. He had wanted to terrorize the woman, not start a full-blown siege. With a final, disgusted look, he melted back into the deeper darkness of the bank's porch and then disappeared into the storm. His pawns had failed. It was time for the king to retreat. The men outside, their courage failing without their patron watching, and perhaps sobered slightly by the fire and the unexpected resistance, began to back away. Their shouts became fainter, swallowed by the storm, until there was only the sound of the rain and the wind and the frantic beating of two hearts in the smoky, violated space of the post office. Outside, on the top step of the boardwalk, the gunbelt lay where it had fallen. The rain washed over the dark leather, pooling in the empty loops of the cartridge belt and running in small rivulets over the cold, hard steel of the holstered Colt. It lay there in the darkness, a silent, powerful object, no longer just a weapon, but a promise, a temporary oath, waiting to be reclaimed. Dawn broke clean and bruised, the world scrubbed raw by the storm. A cool, damp air, smelling of wet earth and pine, had replaced the oppressive, dusty heat. The sky was a pale, fragile blue, and the rising sun cast long, sharp shadows across the mud-slicked street. The only remnants of the night's violence were the shattered window of the post office, boarded up now with a few rough planks Wyatt had found, and the deep, watery ruts carved into the road. Wyatt retrieved his gun belt from the boardwalk where it had lain all night. The leather was dark and supple from the rain. He didn't buckle it on. He held it coiled in one hand, the weight of it a familiar, unsettling burden. He and Lydia moved without speaking, a silent, shared purpose propelling them into the crisp morning air. Their destination was the line of telegraph poles that marched north out of town, disappearing over the first low rise. They had to know if the cut wire was an accident of the storm or something more deliberate. They walked side by side, their boots making sucking sounds in the thick mud. The storm had felled a few cottonwood branches and washed debris across the trail, but the poles themselves, thick and creosoted, stood firm. They checked the first pole, then the second. The wire was intact, humming faintly in the gentle morning breeze. It was at the third pole, set in a shallow dip nearly half a mile from town, that they found it. The wire hadn't snapped or been torn down by a falling branch. It had been cut. The ends were clean, severed with a pair of heavy snips, the copper gleaming brightly in the sun. It was a clean, professional job. Wyatt ran a hand over the rough surface of the pole, his gaze sweeping the ground. "No tracks," he said, his voice low. "The rain washed away everything." "It wasn't the storm," Lydia stated, her voice tight with a mixture of vindication and dread. It was exactly what she had expected to find. Wyatt's attention was fixed on the pole itself. Near the base, a small, perfectly round hole had been drilled, likely a pilot hole for one of the climbing spikes. It was an insignificant detail, one most people would overlook. But Wyatt's life had been a study in insignificant details. He knelt, his eyes narrowed. Inside the shadowed hollow of the hole, he saw it, a faint, almost invisible smudge of color. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small clasp knife, using the tip to gently scrape at the smudge. A few grains of bright blue dust fell into his palm. "Chalk," he said, holding it out for her to see. Lydia leaned in, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's the same color," she began, her voice trailing off as the connection clicked into place. "It's the same color as the chalk the survey crew uses to mark their lines." She had seen them working, stretching long, chalk-dusted strings between their stakes to get a perfectly straight line. The blue dust in Wyatt's hand was not just a clue, it was a signature. They walked back to town in silence, the blue chalk a damning unspoken truth between them. Back in the post office, the air was still thick with the lingering scent of smoke. Lydia went behind the counter, her movements stiff and precise. She knelt and ran her hand along the baseboard beneath the grid of mailboxes. Her fingers found a small, disguised notch, with a firm press. A section of the baseboard clicked open, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. From this secret space, she withdrew a rolled-up sheet of drafting paper. She spread it out on the counter, weighing down the curling corners with a lead inkwell and a heavy postal scale. It was a map, meticulously drawn not in black ink, but in the same shade of violet as the smudge that stained her hand. It was a copy of the official survey map, one she had painstakingly traced from a document Wexler had received by courier 2 days ago. She had stayed late that night, her hand flying across the paper under the soft glow of a single lamp, driven by a premonition she couldn't explain. The map showed the valley, the creek, the town of Dry Willow, and it showed a stark, jagged blue line that represented the high-water mark of the proposed dam. Wyatt leaned over it, his expression grim, his calloused finger, stained with the faintest trace of blue chalk, followed the line. He knew this land not as a series of lines and elevations, but as a living, breathing thing. He knew its secrets, its rhythms. His finger stopped at a small, almost imperceptible mark on the map. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is Bitter Creek Spring. It's the only reliable water source for 3 of the ranches on the South Range during the dry season. Jedediah Croft's place is one of them." His finger moved again, tracing the blue line as it swallowed the spring completely. "And this," he continued, tapping a wide, flat area of pasture land. "This is the winter grazing for 6 smaller homesteads, the only land high enough to stay clear of the first snows. The map showed that, too, would be 100 feet underwater." He straightened up, his eyes meeting hers. The pieces fell into place with brutal, chilling clarity. "This isn't about progress," he said. It's not about bringing water to the valley. It's about taking it away. They flood the springs, drown the best grazing land. They make the ranches worthless. Then Pike steps in and buys the land for pennies on the dollar from ranchers who have no choice but to sell. It was a quiet, bloodless massacre, executed with contracts and surveyor's chalk instead of guns. Lydia felt a cold fury rise within her. How can we prove it? We need more than a map they'll claim is a forgery, Wyatt said. We need something they can't deny, something official. He thought for a moment, his gaze distant. The law in a place like this, it's not always what's written down in a book. Sometimes it's just what's remembered. He looked at her. Reverend Avery. He's been here longer than anyone. He keeps the town records, baptisms, marriages, and the original land grants. They found Reverend Avery tending the small garden behind his church. He was a thin, stooped man with kind, watery eyes and hands permanently stained with the soil he so lovingly tended. Lydia explained the situation in a low, urgent voice, while Wyatt stood back, a silent, watchful presence. The Reverend listened patiently, his expression growing more grave with each word. When Lydia had finished, he wiped his hands on his trousers and led them into the cool, quiet church. From a locked iron box kept in the vestry, he removed a heavy, buckram-bound ledger. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. These are the original founding documents for Dry Willow, he explained, his voice soft. The land grants signed and sealed by the territorial governor 50 years ago. He turned the pages carefully until he found the one for Jedediah Croft's land. The contract was clear. It granted him and his heirs rights not just to the land itself, but to all appurtenant water and access thereto, in perpetuity. It was the old law, the law of memory, designed to protect the very lifeblood of the land. At the bottom was a large ornate wax seal, the official emblem of the territory. Pike's new contracts, the ones these folks signed without understanding. They're designed to supersede this, the Reverend said sadly. But this is the foundation. This is the truth. He agreed to let them make a tracing of the seal. Lydia, with her steady hand, carefully placed a thin piece of paper over it and rubbed it with a piece of soft charcoal from the stove, creating a perfect impression of the old, powerful symbol. It was a fragile weapon, but it was one rooted in justice. That evening, the saloon was buzzing. Wexler, flush with Pike's money and his own arrogance, was holding court. Wyatt slipped in through the batwing doors, taking a seat at a dark, isolated table in the back. He ordered a beer and nursed it, his eyes and ears open. Wexler was laughing, his voice carrying easily over the clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversation. Thaddeus Pike is a man of vision, Wexler declared to the small crowd of sycophants gathered around him, and he is generous to those who help bring his vision to life. A handsome bonus for completing the survey ahead of schedule, another for expediting the necessary preparations. He winked, raising his glass. Progress has its price. Boys, and I, for one, am happy to be paid it. The men around him laughed, oblivious to the true meaning of his words. But Wyatt heard them. He heard the confession hiding behind the boast. He left the saloon and met Lydia by the livery. He recounted what he had heard, his voice devoid of emotion, a simple recitation of the facts. Lydia's hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. We have the map. We have the motive. We have the seal. And now we have his own words. Her voice trembled with a controlled rage. We have to make it public. I'll post the notes, the map, everything, on the board for the whole town to see. Wyatt stepped closer, his shadow falling over her in the deepening twilight. Lydia, he said, his voice low and serious, you do that, and you make yourself the target. Not some abstract idea of the post office, but you. Pike and Wexler won't send drunken surveyors next time. They'll be more direct. The warning was stark, born of a bitter, first-hand knowledge of what desperate, greedy men were capable of. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering light. She was afraid. He could see the slight tremor in her hand as she pushed a stray strand of hair from her face. But her fear was eclipsed by her resolve. The danger is there even when we're silent. Wyatt, she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of an unshakable conviction. "It's in the foreclosure notices. It's in the cut telegraph wire. It's in the faces of my neighbors. Hiding from it doesn't make it go away. It just lets it win." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, seeing the immense strength she held within her small frame. He had spent a lifetime running, keeping himself locked away. She, in her quiet way, was preparing to stand and fight. He gave a slow, single nod. "All right," he said, "but we do it my way. A public notice will just be words they can deny. We need physical proof, something they can't talk their way out of." He glanced down the dark, empty street, his mind working, piecing together a plan. Wexler mentioned being paid for expediting preparations. That means materials. Supplies for the dam are probably being brought in at night. When there are fewer eyes to see, they'll have to be storing them somewhere. He looked back at her, his gaze intense. "There's an old, abandoned lumber warehouse just past the broken bridge. It's isolated. Perfect place to store things you don't want anyone to see." A plan began to form, stark and dangerous. "A supply wagon is due tomorrow night," Wyatt said. "We'll follow it. We get into that warehouse, and we find the proof ledgers, shipping manifests, anything with Pike's or the bank's name on it. Then we don't just post a notice. We take the evidence to the one place in this town that still stands for something. We take it to the Reverend. We hold the trial in the church, in front of the whole town. The sky, which had been a placid, starry canvas just an hour before, turned on them with the speed of a striking snake. There was no gentle preamble of rain this time, only a sudden, violent drop in temperature that made the air feel brittle as glass. Then the first stones hit. They were not the soft, slushy pellets of a winter flurry, but hard, jagged marbles of ice, striking the earth with a sound like 1,000 scattered pebbles. The hailstorm began, a vertical barrage that hammered the roof of the livery and churned the mud in the street into a frothing, pocked soup from the deep shadows of the blacksmith's forge. Wyatt and Lydia watched the supply wagon rumble into view. It was a heavy, lumbering freight wagon, its canvas cover stretched taut over a high, bulky load. The driver sat hunched, his hat pulled low, a slicker gleaming in the faint light from the saloon. Two outriders flanked the wagon, their figures dark and menacing against the churning, unnatural twilight of the storm. They moved with a grim purpose, heading for the one passable route out of town, the temporary bridge over Willow Creek. The bridge was a crude, desperate piece of engineering. Thick planks had been laid across the remaining support pylons, creating a narrow, treacherous span just wide enough for a single wagon. As the freight wagon's heavy, iron-rimmed wheels rolled onto the first planks, the entire structure groaned in protest, a deep, resonant sound of stressed wood that was audible even over the roar of the hail. The horses strained, their hooves slipping on the ice-slicked wood, as the driver urged them forward across the groaning span. Now, Wyatt's voice was a low rumble, barely audible. He led his roan out from the shadows. The horse was already saddled, tense and restless, its ears twitching at the percussive sound of the hail. He swung into the saddle, then reached a hand down to Lydia. She took it without hesitation, and he pulled her up, seating her in front of him. She was light, but the horse shifted under the unfamiliar, double weight. Wyatt wrapped his heavy duster around both of them, a shared shield against the stinging ice. The wool was rough and smelled of horse and rain and him. Lydia settled back against his chest, her hands gripping the thick pommel of the saddle. She could feel the solid, steady beat of his heart against her back, a stark contrast to the frantic hammering of her own. In the frigid, chaotic air, their breaths mingled, rising in a single, fleeting cloud of white mist. He urged the horse forward, not onto the road, but into the thicket of cottonwood trees that lined the creek bed. They moved like a ghost through the rattling leaves, the hail cracking against the branches above them. The wagon cleared the bridge, its iron wheels finding the muddy track on the far side with a final, protesting screech. Wyatt nudged the roan into a canter, keeping parallel to the wagon, using the trees and the storm's din as cover. They were a quarter-mile out when their luck ran out. One of the outriders, perhaps catching a flicker of movement or simply on edge, reined in his horse and peered back into the churning darkness. He shouted something that was snatched away by the wind, then pointed a gloved finger directly at the stand of cottonwoods where they were hidden. A torch was lit, its flame a wild, greasy orange smear against the gray curtain of the storm. Then another, and another. A string of malevolent, dancing lights bloomed along the creek, a chain of fire tightening around them. The chase was on. Wyatt swore, a sharp, guttural sound. He dug his heels into the roan's flanks, and the powerful horse surged forward, breaking from the cover of the trees. The ground was treacherous, a slick layer of mud and ice-covered leaves. The hailstones, no longer buffered by the branches, struck them with the force of thrown rocks. They pinged off the saddle horn like ricochets, stinging Lydia's exposed cheeks and hands. Wyatt hunched lower, trying to shield her with his body. His world narrowed to the path ahead, a constantly shifting calculation of risk and traction. The outriders spurred their mounts, fanning out to cut off their angle of pursuit. They were no longer trying to intercept the wagon. They were the hunted. One of the riders, faster than the others, closed the distance, his horse thundering alongside them. He was a broad, powerfully built man, his face a grimace of effort under the brim of his soaked hat. He reached out, his hand grabbing for their reins, for Lydia's arm, for anything that would slow them down. Wyatt savagely pulled the roan to the side, causing the other horse to stumble, but the man was tenacious. He abandoned his own mount, launching himself through the air in a desperate, reckless leap. His fingers found purchase on the back of Wyatt's saddle. He clung on, a dead weight, his boots dragging in the mud, trying to haul himself aboard or pull them all down. The roan screamed, a high, panicked sound, fighting for its balance. Wyatt wrestled with the reins, his focus entirely on keeping the horse upright. For a terrifying second, Lydia felt them tipping, the world tilting into a chaotic blur of mud and ice. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. Then rage followed, a hot, cleansing fire. She was not helpless. She was not a sack of flour to be protected. She twisted in the saddle, her body screaming in protest. Slung over her shoulder, beneath the heavy duster, was the leather mailbag she had refused to leave behind. It was nearly empty, but its thick leather and heavy brass buckle gave it a satisfying weight. She gripped its strap with both hands and swung it with all the force she could muster. The bag connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening, solid thud. His grip loosened, his eyes wide with surprise. She swung again, a wild, desperate arc of leather and brass. This time it caught him square on the jaw. His head snapped back, and with a grunt of pain, he lost his hold completely, tumbling backward into the churning, muddy creek bank. They were clear. Wyatt didn't look back. He urged the horse on, pushing it to its absolute limit. Ahead, the temporary bridge loomed, their only path back to the relative safety of the town. The wagon was far ahead now, but the remaining riders were closing in, their torches bobbing furiously in the dark. They hit the bridge at a full gallop. The planks bowed and screamed under the horse's frantic hooves. The entire structure swayed, a living thing in its death throes. They were halfway across when Wyatt did something that made Lydia's heart stop. While still at a gallop, he uncoiled the lariat from his saddle horn. In one fluid, impossibly fast motion, he swung the rope, not at their pursuers, but at the bridge itself. The loop shot out and settled perfectly over the head of a huge iron bolt that served as the linchpin for the last section of the makeshift span. He wrapped the other end of the rope around his saddle horn, pulled the roan up in a jarring halt on the solid ground of the far bank, and yelled, "Hold on!" The rope went taut. The pursuing riders were just hitting the bridge. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a giant's cracking knuckle, the iron bolt tore loose from the water-softened wood. The final section of the bridge, the section the riders were on, sagged violently. With a final, ear-splitting groan of splintering timber, it collapsed, plunging the men and their screaming horses into the churning, ice-choked creek below. Their torches were extinguished with a series of angry hisses, plunging the world back into darkness. They didn't wait to see the outcome. Wyatt guided the roan into the deep shadows of the abandoned lumber warehouse. He slid from the saddle, his legs unsteady, and helped Lydia down. Her own legs felt like water, and she stumbled against him. They stood there for a moment, leaning on each other, their bodies trembling from cold and adrenaline. They had made it. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows, smelling of sawdust and damp decay. They found a relatively dry corner, hidden behind a tall stack of rotting lumber. Inside, the roar of the storm was muted to a low, drumming murmur. Wyatt moved to a grimy window and peered out. The supply wagon was just visible, pulling up to a smaller, more secure shed at the far end of the property. They waited. After what felt like an eternity, the wagon, now unloaded, rumbled away. The lights in the shed were extinguished. Silence returned, broken only by the sound of the subsiding hail. Under the cover of the dying storm, they slipped from the main warehouse to the shed. The lock was heavy, but the hasp was set in old, soft wood. Wyatt used the flat end of his hunting knife as a lever, and with a groan of protesting metal, the lock tore free. The air inside was cold and still. In the thin, gray light filtering through a crack in the wall, they saw the treasure they had risked everything for. Stacked high were crates of blasting powder and boxes of new steel drills, but it wasn't the equipment that held their attention. On one of the crates was a stencil, freshly painted. It was a familiar, ornate seal, the official emblem of the Dry Willow Bank, Thaddeus Pike's seal, and on a small, overturned barrel that had been used as a makeshift desk lay a ledger. Lydia's hands trembled as she picked it up. She lit a small lucifer match, its flare a sudden, blinding light in the darkness. Wyatt stood guard at the door, his hand now resting on the worn grip of his holstered Colt. In the flickering, dying light of the match, Lydia saw the columns, the names, the numbers. It was a disbursement ledger. There were payments to Grant Wexler, payments to the survey crew, and a whole series of payments to local ranchers, the same ones whose names were on the foreclosure list. But the column heading was not loan or wages. It was a single, chilling word: protection. Lydia pulled the mailbag from her shoulder. From it, she took a few sheets of blank paper and a small square of carbon paper, the tools of her trade. She worked quickly, her hands sure and steady despite the cold. She placed the carbon paper between the ledger page and a blank sheet and, using a small pencil, carefully traced each entry. The violet carbon left a perfect, incriminating copy. Her hands became smudged with the ink, but her eyes, even in the near darkness, shone with a bright, triumphant light. Outside, the last of the hail gave way to a soft, steady rain. The storm had broken. Inside the cold, dark shed, the only sounds were the scratching of Lydia's pencil and the steady, rhythmic sound of their breathing. A warmth that had nothing to do with the weather began to grow between them, an unspoken heat generated by shared risk and a silent, profound understanding. They had found the truth, and now they had to find a way to survive it. The Sabbath arrived not with peace, but with a taut, humming tension that vibrated in the damp morning air. The church, usually a place of quiet contemplation, had been transformed. It was a courtroom, a town hall, a theater of reckoning. There was no judge in a black robe, no formal jury box. The jury was the entire population of Dry Willow, packed into the pews, their faces a gallery of hope, fear, and grim curiosity. Ranchers in their stiff Sunday suits, their wives in worn but neatly pressed dresses, shopkeepers, the blacksmith, even a few prospectors from the hills, they were all there. They filled the narrow aisle and stood 3 deep at the back, a silent, collective witness. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, old wood, and the faint, sweet scent of hymnals. Light filtered through the simple colored glass of the windows, painted soft lozenges of blue and amber on the worn floorboards. At the front, before the altar, stood a simple pine table. On one side was Thaddeus Pike and a nervous-looking Grant Wexler. Pike appeared utterly composed, almost bored, as if this were a minor and slightly distasteful administrative matter. Wexler, however, kept wiping his damp palms on his trousers, his eyes darting nervously toward the crowd. On the other side of the table stood Lydia Hart. Beside her, his face a mask of solemn gravity, was Reverend Avery, and standing a few feet behind her, a silent, unmovable pillar of support, was Wyatt Hale. He had buckled his gunbelt on this morning, the weight of it a necessary concession to the day's uncertainty, but he stood with his hands clasped loosely in front of him, a man observing, not participating. Sheriff Lyle stood near the door, his presence lending a thin, fragile veneer of officialdom to the proceedings. He had declared this a public inquiry, a semi-formal hearing to address the grievances that had threatened to tear the town apart. It was a desperate measure, a prairie town's attempt to find its own justice when the law was 100 miles away. Reverend Avery, his voice calm and steady, called the gathering to order. He spoke not of law, but of community, of the bonds of trust that held a place like Dry Willow together. Then, he nodded to Lydia. She stepped forward, a small, determined figure in the cavernous room. Her hands trembled, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong. "Mr. Pike, Mr. Wexler," she began, her gaze fixed on them, "have brought a project to this valley that they claim is for the public good. But some of us have had questions about rising debts, about strange fees, about the true cost of this progress." She unrolled the violet-inked map and laid it on the table. A low murmur went through the crowd as they saw the blue line that cut so callously across their lands. Then, she produced the carbon copies from the ledger. She held them up. "Last night, we found the supply depot for the dam project, and we found this." She laid the first sheet on the table, the one detailing the payments. "This is a record of payments from an account tied to the Dry Willow Bank, payments to Mr. Wexler, and payments to many of you here." She looked out at the crowd, her eyes finding Jedediah Croft and a half-dozen other ranchers, payments listed not as loans, but as fees for protection. Pike let out a short, dismissive laugh. "An interesting piece of fiction, Miss Hart. A child's scrawl on a piece of paper. You have no proof. The handwriting on these entries," Lydia continued, her voice rising slightly, "matches known samples from both Mr. Pike and Mr. Wexler." She slid 2 other documents onto the table, a signed banknote from Pike and Wexler's official survey proposal. The looping, arrogant signature of the surveyor and the tight, precise script of the banker were undeniably the same as those in the ledger. A ripple of anger went through the pews. It was one thing to hear rumors, it was another to see the evidence laid bare in the house of God. Pike's smile didn't falter. He simply reached into his coat and produced a folded, official-looking document, tied with a ribbon. This, on the other hand, is not fiction. This is a charter, filed with the territorial government, declaring the Willow Creek Dam a project of public interest. He spread it open. The paper was heavy, the language dense with legal jargon. It states clearly that the project will provide irrigation, control flooding, and allow for the future growth and prosperity of this entire region. What you call protection fees, Miss Hart, are simply administrative levies, perfectly legal, to ensure the smooth and timely completion of this vital work. He was using the law as a bludgeon, drowning their simple truths in a flood of complex, incomprehensible words. The crowd shifted, their anger now mixed with confusion. It was a masterful performance. He was making them doubt the evidence of their own eyes. Sheriff Lyle, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. He wasn't a man for complex arguments, but he was a man who understood physical evidence. He held up a small, canvas-wrapped object. "Mr. Pike, when I took your statement this morning about the disturbance at the post office, I asked to see the contents of your bank's vault for insurance purposes. You obliged." He unwrapped the object. It was a heavy brass seal, the kind used for impressing wax on important documents. "This is the official seal of the Dry Willow Bank." He then walked over to a splintered wooden plank that was leaning against the wall. "This came off one of the crates at the lumber warehouse. Wyatt Hale brought it in this morning." He pointed to a faint, circular impression on the wood. "The mark on the crate and this seal, they are a perfect match." The room fell silent. It was a simple, undeniable connection. A direct line from the secret supply depot to the banker who stood before them, claiming ignorance. Pike's smile finally faltered. a small crack in his polished facade. Wyatt had not moved a muscle. He watched Lydia, saw the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the edge of the table. She looked for a second as if she might waver, overwhelmed by the pressure, by the weight of all those expectant faces. She glanced back at him, her eyes wide with uncertainty. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all it took, a silent transfer of strength. "You can do this." She took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening. Her resolve returned, harder than before. It was Reverend Avery who spoke next, his voice filling the quiet church. He held up the old, buckram-bound ledger. "Mr. Pike speaks of the territory's law. It is a good law, but there is an older law in this valley, the law upon which this town was founded." He opened the book, its pages whispering like dry leaves. The original land grants, signed 50 years ago, guarantee the holders not just the land, but all water rights connected to it. It is a sacred trust, a covenant between the people and the land. No charter of public interest, written 100 miles away by men who have never set foot here, can erase that trust. He looked directly at Pike. "Your plan is not to provide water, sir. It is to steal it. It is to—" The words, spoken with the simple, profound authority of a man of God, struck home more than any legal argument could. The mood in the church shifted, solidifying from confused anger into a hard, collective certainty. They were being cheated. Sheriff Lyle, seeing his moment, stepped forward and raised a hand. "We don't have the authority here to find a man guilty or innocent, but we have the authority to seek the truth." He looked at the ranchers, then at Pike. "I am ordering a 10-day stay on all dam-related activities and all foreclosure proceedings by the bank. I will ride to the county seat myself with this evidence. We will have a federal marshal look into this matter. Until then, nothing moves forward." It was a victory, a fragile, temporary one, but a victory nonetheless. A collective sigh of relief went through the church. Pike, his face a thunderous mask, turned and stalked out, Wexler scurrying in his wake like a chastened dog. The church erupted. People surged forward, their faces alight with gratitude. They surrounded Lydia, clapping her on the shoulder, shaking her hand, their voices a babble of thanks. "You saved us, Miss Hart. God bless you." Lydia Jedediah Croft. His eyes wet with tears, simply took her hand in both of his and held it, unable to speak. Wyatt faded back, letting her have the moment, his presence no longer needed. He slipped out the side door and onto the covered porch. The storm was long gone, but a fine, misty rain, a mizzle, was falling, making the air smell clean and new. A few minutes later, Lydia emerged from the crowd, looking dazed and overwhelmed. She saw him and walked over, the noise and celebration of the church fading behind her. They stood together in the quiet grayness of the porch, the soft patter of the mist on the roof the only sound. "You were good in there," he said, his voice low. "I was terrified," she admitted, a shaky laugh escaping her. She looked up at him, her face open and luminous in the soft light. The guard she always kept in place was gone, washed away by the emotional torrent of the morning. Everything was there in her eyes, the gratitude, the fear, the exhaustion, and something more, something deeper and more vulnerable. He saw it, and something inside the fortress he had built around himself cracked. He took a half-step closer. The small space between them became charged, electric. He could smell the faint scent of lavender soap from her hair, mixed with the smoky residue of the fire. She raised her face to his, her lips slightly parted. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them on that quiet porch, suspended in a bubble of rain-swept silence. It was happening. A connection forged in violence and suspicion was about to be sealed with a moment of gentle, profound peace. He leaned down. Her eyes fluttered closed. "Miss Hart, Miss Hart." The bubble burst. The baker's wife came bustling out onto the porch, her face beaming, followed by a small contingent of other townswomen. "We just wanted to thank you again. We're all going over to the boarding house for a celebration lunch. You must come. You're the guest of honor." Lydia stepped back, the moment broken, the spell shattered. A faint blush colored her cheeks. She forced a smile for the women, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. That's very kind of you. I'd be honored." The women bustled away, their happy chatter filling the air. Lydia and Wyatt were alone again, but the intimacy was gone, replaced by a sudden, awkward awareness. She looked at the damp floorboards for a moment before meeting his gaze. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "When we're still fighting," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't make promises." It wasn't a rejection. It was a statement of fact. A wise, weary acknowledgement that their battle was not yet won, and that a kiss, in that moment, would be a promise of a future they hadn't yet earned. Wyatt understood. He said nothing. He simply held her gaze and gave another of his small, slow nods, an obedient silence that spoke more than words ever could. It said, "I understand. I will wait." From across the street, partially hidden in the alleyway beside the saloon, Grant Wexler watched them. He was no longer the nervous, sweating sycophant from the church. His face was hard, his eyes cold with a new resolve. Two men stepped out of the shadows to join him. They were strangers, hard-faced and carrying themselves with the quiet, dangerous confidence of men who lived by the gun. Wexler spoke to them in a low, urgent voice, gesturing with his head toward the church porch, toward Wyatt and Lydia. A fresh roll of bills passed from his hand to theirs. A new plan, born of desperation and a lust for revenge, was already clicking into place. The 10-day reprieve was not a truce. It was merely the quiet before a different, more deadly storm. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a smell. A sharp, resinous tang of burning pine that slithered through the open windows of the town, waking light sleepers and setting dogs to a low, uneasy whining. Then came the light, a flicker against the low-hanging clouds, then a steady, pulsing orange glow that silhouetted the familiar, gentle slope of the hills behind Dry Willow. The town came awake with a start, doors slamming open, voices calling out in the darkness, a current of alarm arcing from house to house. The hill was on fire. It was not a small fire. A hungry, jagged line of flame was chewing its way up the slope, consuming the dry grass and sagebrush with a terrifying speed. The wind, which had been calm all evening, seemed to have been born from the blaze itself, whipping the flames into a frenzy and carrying sparks like malevolent fireflies into the darkness. Wyatt Hale was out of the livery before the first proper alarm bell had been rung. He met Sheriff Lyle in the middle of the street, the older man pulling on his boots as he ran. There was no need for discussion. They both saw the fire for what it was, not an accident of lightning or a careless campfire. The line of the blaze was too straight, too deliberate. It was an act of war. "It's a land-clearing fire," Wyatt said, his voice a low, hard growl against the rising crackle from the hill. "They're trying to create a fact on the ground, burn it all off, devalue it, then claim the dam is the only way to make it useful again." "Bucket Brigade," Lyle snapped, his mind already working. "Get the men, all of them. Meet at the town well." Chaos was threatening to take hold, but the two men became anchors of grim purpose. As men poured from their homes, some with rifles, some with nothing but fear in their eyes, Lyle and Wyatt turned them into a single, functioning unit. "Forget your guns," the sheriff roared, his voice cutting through the panic. "Your enemy is the fire. 2 lines, one to the well, one up the hill. Move while they organized the men." Lydia took charge of the women and children. The fire was still a safe distance away, but the smoke was growing thicker, and panic was a contagion, especially among the young. "The church," she called out, her voice clear and commanding. "Everyone, take the children to the church, bring blankets and water. It's the safest place in town." She moved through the small, frightened clusters, her calm a reassuring balm. She helped a mother soothe a crying toddler, guided a dazed-looking elderly woman, and organized the older children into a line to carry buckets of water, not for the fire, but for the people gathered in the sanctuary. The church, which had been their courtroom, now became their haven. The work of fighting the fire was brutal and heartbreakingly futile. The line of men stretched from the well, up the main street, and to the base of the burning hill. Buckets of water, passed from hand to hand, were sloshed and spilled, with barely half the contents reaching the inferno. Each bucket thrown onto the blaze hissed into steam, a pathetic offering against the roaring wall of heat. The men's faces were soon streaked with soot and sweat, their eyes red and streaming from the thick, acrid smoke. Wyatt worked in the line, his movements economical and tireless, but his mind was elsewhere. He watched the fire, not as a firefighter, but as a tracker. He saw the pattern, the unnatural straightness of its advance. He saw how it seemed to be following a specific contour of the land, leaving his place in the line. He began to move along the flank of the blaze, his eyes scanning the ground, illuminated in the flickering, hellish light. And then he saw him. Through a gap in the smoke, he caught a glimpse of a figure. It was Grant Wexler. But Wexler wasn't fighting the fire. He was working. In his hand was a mallet and a canvas bag of survey stakes. In the midst of the inferno he had helped create, he was pounding new, illegal markers into the scorched earth, using the fire as a cover for his crime, grimly attempting to finish his map of ruin. Wyatt moved toward him, a dark shape detaching itself from the chaos. Wexler, intent on his task, didn't see him until he was only a few feet away. The surveyor's head snapped up, his face a mask of guilt and terror in the firelight. He dropped the mallet and turned to run. Wyatt was on him in 2 strides. They grappled, 2 figures silhouetted against the roaring flames. It was not a fight of skill, but a desperate, clumsy struggle. They slipped on the loose, ash-covered ground, their boots skidding on pine needles. Wexler was younger, but fear and desperation gave Wyatt a cold, hard strength. They stumbled and rolled, locked together, getting dangerously close to a place where the hill fell away into a steep, rocky ravine. The roar of the fire was in their ears, the heat a physical presence, scorching their skin. They came to a stop at the very precipice of the ravine. Wyatt had Wexler pinned, his forearm pressed against the surveyor's throat. Below them, the darkness was absolute. "It's over, Wexler," Wyatt grunted, his voice raspy from the smoke. Terror finally broke the man. "It wasn't my idea," he shrieked, his voice thin and high with panic. He thrashed, his foot slipping on a loose rock. For a heart-stopping second, he dangled over the edge. Wyatt's grip the only thing keeping him from falling into the blackness. The raw, primal fear of death stripped him of all pretense. It was Pike. It was all Pike, he screamed, the words tumbling out in a torrent. The dam was never about water. It was a land grab. He's been bleeding the ranchers dry for years, waiting. He was going to use the dam to flood them out, ruin the land, and buy it all for nothing. Lydia, who had come up the hill with a bucket of water for the men closest to the fire, had been drawn by the sounds of the struggle. She stopped in the shadows of a large boulder, the confession washing over her, each word a confirmation of their worst fears. Suddenly, another figure appeared, stepping out from behind a stand of burning pines. It was Thaddeus Pike. In his hand was a small, silver-plated derringer, and it was pointed directly at Wexler. His face, illuminated by the fire, was a cold, reptilian mask of fury. He had come to silence his liability. "You foolish, chattering coward," Pike hissed. He fired. The sound of the shot was small and flat, almost lost in the roar of the fire. But Wyatt had seen the movement, the glint of the gun. He didn't have time to draw his own weapon. He reacted instinctively. He lunged, not at Pike, but at the banker's outstretched arm, shoving it hard, upward and to the side. The bullet, meant for Wexler's heart, went wide. It struck the steel head of the survey stake Wexler had just hammered into the ground. The impact sent a shower of bright, angry orange sparks into the night, a brief, brilliant firework against the backdrop of the larger blaze. That small, bright flash, and the flat crack of the gunshot, was a signal. The men on the fire line, who had been focused on the flames, turned as one. They saw the scene illuminated as if on a stage. Wexler, pale and trembling, Pike, holding a smoking pistol, and Wyatt, standing between them. The bucket brigade stopped. The townspeople, drawn by the sound of the shot, began to move up the hill, their faces grim in the flickering light. They formed a silent, tightening circle. Sheriff Lyle pushed his way to the front, his own revolver now in his hand. "Pike," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Drop it." Pike looked around at the ring of hostile, soot-stained faces. The fire was behind him, and his entire town was in front of him. There was no escape. The derringer fell from his numb fingers. Lyle moved forward and swiftly put the man in cuffs, retrieving the still warm pistol from the ground. The fire on the hill seemed to pause, as if it, too, were watching the human drama unfold. Lydia stepped out from the shadows, the carbon copies from the ledger clutched in her hand. She gave them to Reverend Avery, who had come up the hill with the others. By the light of a dozen lanterns brought up from the town, the Reverend's voice rose, clear and steady, reading each incriminating entry aloud. He read the names of the ranchers. He read the amounts paid. He read the word protection. Each phrase he spoke seemed to douse a piece of the fire, replacing the heat of the flames with the cold, hard certainty of the truth. Wexler, a broken man, was given a pen and a sheet of paper, in front of the entire town, with the smoke of his own crime stinging his eyes. He wrote out and signed a full confession, his signature a shaky, spidery scrawl. As he finished, the wind shifted. A breeze, cool and damp, blew in from the west, pushing back against the fire. The flames, which had been roaring toward the sky, began to shrink, to die down. The aggressive, angry red faded to a sullen, glowing orange, slowly, painstakingly. The black line of the horizon, stark and clean, reappeared against the paling, pre-dawn sky. The people of Dry Willow looked at Wyatt Hale. They had known him for days as the quiet stranger, the rumored gunslinger, a man defined by the weapon at his hip. But tonight, they had seen something else. They had seen him organize them. They had seen him risk himself to expose a crime. And they remembered the story from the church, the story of the man who had faced down 4 armed men and had chosen not to draw his gun, but to lay it on the ground. They saw not the violence in his past, but the deliberate, difficult peace he was trying to build. In a land that respected the fast draw, they suddenly found themselves in awe of a different, more profound kind of strength. They saw not the gunslinger, but the man who had laid his gun down a form of honor so rare it was almost holy. The wheels of official justice, once set in motion, ground slowly but with an inexorable weight. The federal marshal who arrived from the county seat was a grim, quiet man who listened more than he spoke. He reviewed Wexler's signed confession, examined the bank's ledgers, and walked the charred ground of the hillside. Within a week, the verdict was delivered, not in a courtroom, but in a series of official notices tacked to the church door. The Willow Creek Dam project was canceled, its charter revoked on grounds of fraud and conspiracy. All debts related to Thaddeus Pike's protection and administrative fees were declared null and void. Pike himself, along with the 2 hired men from the alley, was taken away in irons, his reign of quiet terror ending not with a bang, but with the quiet clink of a marshal's handcuffs. A fever had broken over Dry Willow. The frantic heat of fear and uncertainty was replaced by a kind of weary, bone-deep calm. The town breathed again, a collective, shuddering sigh of relief. It was in the midst of this fragile new peace that the stagecoach brought the mail. For Lydia, it was a return to the familiar, comforting rhythm of her life. The weight of the leather bag, the crisp feel of envelopes, the sorting and stamping, it was a world of order that she had fought to protect. But one letter stood out. It was not the rough, homespun paper of a local rancher. The envelope was thick and creamy, the address written in a perfect, elegant script. The postmark was Santa Vespera, a prosperous city on the new rail line, a place spoken of in Dry Willow with a kind of mythical reverence. Inside, the letter was even more impressive. It was an offer, penned by the chairman of the Santa Vespera Civic Committee. They had heard of her competence, of her dedication. They were opening a new public library, a grand brick building with tall windows and shelves that would stretch to the ceiling. They were offering her the position of head librarian. The salary they named was more than double what she earned now, a sum that represented not just comfort, but security, a life free from the constant, grinding worry of making ends meet. It was an offer of a different world, a world of polished floors and quiet reading rooms, of civilized conversation and afternoon tea, a world without mud or smoke or the threat of violence. It was the life she had once thought she wanted, the life she had been working toward before failure and fear had sent her running to this dusty corner of the world. She held the letter in her hand, the heavy paper a tangible weight, a physical manifestation of a crossroads she had not expected to face. That evening, as a sliver of moon rose in the indigo sky, she saw a light in the livery. She walked toward it, her footsteps silent on the damp earth. Through the open doorway, she saw Wyatt. He was not cleaning his tack or tending to his horse. He was packing. His movements were slow, deliberate, each item placed in his saddlebags with a finality that made her heart ache. His bedroll was already tightly bound. His duster was folded neatly. He was preparing to leave. He was a man who knew how to disappear. He had been a ghost for years, moving from town to town, leaving nothing behind but whispers. She understood why. As long as he stayed here, he was a story. He was the man Silas Cantrell was hunting. He was a lightning rod, and she, by standing with him, was standing in the middle of the thunderstorm. To leave was the most honorable thing he could do. It was an act of protection, a way of keeping the trouble that followed him from ever touching her. It was a selfless, painful, and utterly wrong decision. She didn't announce herself. She turned and walked back to the post office, her mind a tumult of conflicting emotions. She went to the corner where she had propped it after the night of the fire. His gun belt. She lifted it. The leather was still stiff from its night in the rain. The weight of it was immense, a physical anchor to the past, to a life of violence and vigilance. It was everything she had ever feared, everything she had ever wanted to run from. She carried it back to the livery, her steps now firm, her purpose clear. He heard her approach and looked up from his work. His face was a mask of careful neutrality, but she saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. He had been hoping to be gone before morning, to spare them both the agony of a farewell. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask him where he was going. She simply held out the gun belt. The heavy holster and the brass-cased cartridges glinted in the lantern light. He looked at it, then at her, his expression unreadable. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, yet it filled the entire space between them. "If I let you in," she said, her eyes locked on his, "don't make me regret it." The words hung in the air, the echo of her silent plea from that first day, now spoken aloud. It was a challenge, a testament of faith, and an ultimatum all in one. Wyatt looked at her for a long, silent moment. The carefully constructed walls of his fortress seemed to crumble, not in a violent explosion, but in a slow, quiet erosion. He reached out and took the gun belt from her. His hands were steady. He didn't buckle it on. Instead, he unlatched the loading gate of the Colt. With a practiced thumb, he rotated the cylinder and ejected each of the 5 cartridges, letting them fall one by one into his other palm, a soft, metallic clicking in the quiet stable. Then, with the tip of his knife, he carefully unfastened the hammer mechanism, rendering the weapon inert. He coiled the empty belt and held out the gun, but first, to her, it was no longer a weapon. It was just a piece of sculpted steel and wood. A relic. "I'll still leave it at your door," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He was not giving up who he was. He was promising to leave the most dangerous part of himself outside her life, a sentry at the gate. A few days later, the whole town came together to rebuild the bridge. It was not a formal project, but a communal act of healing. The blacksmith fired his forge, shaping new iron bolts. The ranchers hauled fresh-cut lumber from the high country. The men worked side by side, the rhythmic sound of hammers and saws a symphony of reconstruction. Wyatt was among them, his sleeves rolled up, his back straining with the others as they hoisted a heavy support beam into place. He was no longer the stranger, the outsider. He was just a man with a strong back and a willingness to work. At the same time, a crew from the telegraph company arrived, and Lydia helped them string a new, stronger steel wire across the poles, its length gleaming in the sun, tense and vung. It was during a break in the work on the bridge that Sheriff Lyle approached Wyatt. He offered the younger man a plug of tobacco, which Wyatt politely declined. They stood for a moment, watching the men work. The town council voted. The sheriff said, not looking at him. They don't have much money. Not enough for a full-time paid deputy. He paused. But they did authorize me to offer you the position. Unpaid. He finally turned to look at Wyatt, a shrewd, calculating look in his eye. In exchange for your services keeping the peace, the town would ask something else of you. The baker's boy, Sam, and a few of the others. They look at you like you're some kind of hero. They need to learn to ride properly. They need to learn a bit of discipline, how to be men. It was more than a job offer. It was an invitation to put down roots, a way to serve the town not with his gun, but with his character. That night, Lydia sat at her desk. 2 letters lay before her, the one from Santa Vespera, with its promise of a safe, comfortable future, and a blank sheet of paper representing the uncertain, difficult, but profoundly real future that was taking shape around her. She dipped her pen in the violet ink. Her hand was steady as she wrote, the words flowing easily. She politely, and with deep gratitude, declined the offer of the position of head librarian. She signed her name, her signature a little less perfect now, a little more human. As she folded the letter, a single tear she hadn't realized was forming escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it with a handkerchief. She brushed it away with the back of her sleeve, leaving a faint, violet smudge on her skin, a mark of her trade, her town, her choice. The first hint of dawn was a pale, gray line on the eastern horizon. A profound stillness lay over Dry Willow, the quiet that comes just before the world awakens. From the church, a single bell began to toll, not the urgent peal of an alarm, but a soft, gentle ringing, calling the faithful to an early morning prayer. The clear, resonant notes drifted on the cool air, washing over the silent houses, over the new bridge, over the livery stable and the post office, and in the quiet, guarded rooms inside Wyatt Hale and Lydia Hart, rooms that had been locked and bolted for years against the pain of the past and the fear of the future. The sound of that gentle bell was like a key. With a soft, final click, the locks gave way, and the doors swung silently, irrevocably, open. The door of the post office opened to a new kind of morning. The air, washed clean by the recent rains and the fire's catharsis, smelled of fresh sawn pine. Above the door, a new sign hung. The old, faded post-telegraph had been taken down. In its place was a longer plank of wood, the letters neatly carved and painted by the town's carpenter, then sealed by Lydia's careful hand. It read, Dry Willow Post, Telegraph Reading Room. It was a small change, just a few words, but it felt like a monumental shift, a declaration that this was no longer just a place of transit for news and money, but a place for the community to put down intellectual roots. On the wide, covered porch, another transformation had taken place. Wyatt had taken his old, battered saddle, the one that had been his only constant companion through years of lonely wandering, and had mounted it to the wall. The worn leather, scarred with the memory of 1,000 miles, was no longer a tool of a transient life. With its deep seat and high cantle, it now served as a unique and beautiful bookshelf, a perfect symbol of a wanderer come home. Lydia was carefully arranging the first books upon it. There was a thick medical textbook with detailed anatomical drawings, its presence a quiet nod to her own past and her continuing service to the town. Beside it, she placed a well-loved copy of The Swiss Family Robinson and a few primers with large, simple letters for the children. It was a library born of practicality and hope, a collection for healing the body and nurturing the mind. Just inside the door, another relic had been given a new purpose. Wyatt's gunbelt hung from a heavy iron peg on the wall. The leather was coiled, the Colt revolver resting peacefully in its holster, the hammer mechanism gone, the cylinder empty. It was an artifact, a captured piece of a violent history, now rendered harmless. It was a memory that had been given a place of honor, but also a place of containment. Directly beneath it, Lydia had hung a small, neatly lettered sign of her own, "No firearms in the reading room." The rule was not just for the townspeople. It was a constant, visible reminder of the promise he had made to her, and to himself. The quiet of the morning was broken by a new, yet familiar sound. From inside the reading room, the telegraph key began to chatter. It was not the frantic, desperate clicking of a crisis, but a steady, rhythmic tapping. Sheriff Lyle, his face grim with the satisfaction of a job well done, was sending his first official dispatch over the newly repaired line. He was transmitting his final report to the federal marshal, formally closing the case on the fraud and conspiracy of the Willow Creek Dam. The crisp, metallic sound echoed in the quiet room, no longer a symbol of isolation and vulnerability, but the sound of a steady, healthy heartbeat, the pulse of a town reconnected to the world, but this time, on its own terms. Later that morning, the town bore witness to the final act of the drama. A covered wagon, the kind used to transport prisoners, was parked in front of the sheriff's office. Thaddeus Pike, no longer the immaculate, composed banker, but a haggard man in wrinkled clothes, was led out in chains. He did not look at the crowd of silent townspeople who had gathered to watch. He kept his eyes fixed on the wagon's floor, a man utterly defeated by the quiet courage of the community he had sought to destroy. Grant Wexler stood by the new bridge, his head bowed as the wagon carrying his former employer rumbled past. He had given his full testimony and, in a strange act of penance, had spent the last 2 days working alongside the very men he had tried to ruin, helping to rebuild the bridge. He had not earned their forgiveness, but in the shared, honest labor, he had perhaps taken the first step toward reclaiming some small piece of his own humanity. For the first time in a long time, the law in Dry Willow felt like it belonged to the people. It felt real. As the dust from the departing wagon settled, Wyatt was sweeping the porch of the new reading room, a simple, domestic task he performed with the same focused intensity he had once reserved for scanning a dangerous horizon. Lydia came out of the post office, a small object concealed in her hand. She walked over to him, stopping so close he could see the faint violet ink smudge that always seemed to linger on her skin. She opened her hand. Lying in her palm was a small, simple, iron key. It was not ornate or new. It was a key that had seen use. She took his large, calloused hand and pressed the key into his palm, closing his fingers around it. "It's the key to the back door," she said, her voice soft, but with an undercurrent of profound strength. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and direct. "The back door of the post office, and of my home." He looked down at the key, then back at her. The world seemed to shrink, the sounds of the town fading away until there was only the two of them, standing in the warm morning sun. He didn't speak. Words were insufficient for a moment like this. He leaned down and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away a stray wisp of hair. His kiss was slow and sure. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or storybook romance. It was a kiss that tasted of the future. It held the promise of shared work, of quiet evenings spent reading by the fire, of facing down whatever storms were yet to come, together. It was a kiss grounded in the reality of the life they were choosing to build, a life that smelled of fresh-cut wood and new paper and the rich, dark earth of the valley. She pulled back just enough to speak, her breath warm against his lips. She whispered the words that had become their private covenant, the challenge that had started it all. "If I let you in." He looked into her eyes, and his response was not the one she expected. It was not a negation of a fear, but the affirmation of a hope. "I'll make it a home," he said, far off, from the direction of the creek. A sound drifted up to them, clear and bright on the morning air. It was the sound of children, their laughter echoing as they chased each other across the solid, new timbers of the Willow Creek Bridge. Dry Willow had not become a rich town overnight. The land was still hard, the winters still long, but as the sun climbed higher, casting its warm, golden light over the valley, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. The town was no longer afraid. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and let us know your city or country so we can all connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. Your support means the world to us.